everyone. My name is Kelly, and I'll be going over the genetics affirmative today. First, we're going to start with a review of affirmative structure. So the genetics affirmative is a varsity affirmative, which contains 5 parts: the plan, inherency, solvency, and then 2 advantages: the research advantage and then a vaccinations advantage. And the purpose of this affirmative is to extend the definition of intellectual property to protect the genetic material of people and to prevent medical exploitation. Thus, the plan, which the USFG should significantly strengthen its protection of IP rights by creating a property right interest in the body. So first, on to the inherency. Inherency is the problem in the flow or the current state of things that the plan will help alleviate/fix. And then within the 2 May 2023 card, it establishes that previous cases have established a legal precedent, which means a general guidelines for the rulings that courts will use in the case of two parties bringing up a case that has something similar and where the facts are similar, where human biological materials are not considered personal property, and it makes it difficult to claim ownership. And this is important because Henrietta Lacks is a woman whose cells were taken without her consent in order to create the HeLa cell line, which fueled biotechnological innovations and corporate profits, while she ultimately died shortly after the taking of her cells, which happened without her knowledge, and was ultimately left in poverty, and her family was unable to see the benefits of her cells and what came from them. So the next is the solvency for a research advantage, in which Fisher-O'Leary argues that recognizing property rights in human tissues, like the HeLa cells from Henrietta Lacks, would ensure that patients are compensated without harming medical research, and that the recognition of property rights in human tissue would incentivize ethical donations and prevent future exploitation. This would essentially mean that donations that are ethical will no longer run the risk of breaching like privacy, breaching control, and basically meaning that people are willingly giving up parts of like their cells or the genetic material in order to be studied for science. The second card in the research advantage states that currently medical research uses human tissue without the knowledge and consent of millions of patients. And this argument is that millions of tissue samples from patients like Henrietta Lacks are stored and used in research without clear consent as they're taken during routine medical examinations or even treatments, and then they're later on used in research, and that raises concerns about ongoing unethical practices. And lac cells, which were taken without consent, contributed to various medical innovations which were very significant, such as the polio and COVID-19 vaccines, but Lack's family did not benefit financially, as seen by her descendants not being able to afford health insurance today. The last card in the research advantage highlights the impact being racial justice. Wait, let me just make sure. The next card basically states that Black Americans, including Henrietta Lacks, have historically been exploited in medical research without consent, and that there's a legacy rooted in such a thing with the Tuskegee experiment and the use of enslaved Black women in gynecological studies, showcasing that, especially within the Tuskegee study, as Black men were knowingly infected with syphilis and were studied and observed in order to basically showcase the progression of disease and experiment upon new treatments. And this all happened without the knowledge and consent of the people involved and left hundreds of them to die. So, due to this, medical distrust persists within the Black community, especially due to discriminatory beliefs such as racial science and racialized medical science, and then also unequal treatment by medical professionals, which ultimately leads to underrepresentation in studies and biased care. And this is particularly important because that means that new innovations, such as new drugs that go onto the market, may have unknown effects when it comes to Black patients and may have differing efficacy levels, and that is something that would be unknown. And the plan's push for the recognition and compensation for historical wrongs, like Black's case, would be essential to addressing the medical racism, which has been persistent and which has occurred. And therefore, we get to the last card within the research advantage, which is the impact card. So, Baptiste 2022 states that the legacy of unethical medical research has disproportionately targeted Black Americans. Again, from the exploitation of enslaved women in gynecological experiments, and then especially in the unethical use of Henrietta Lacks cells without her consent. And the use of race as a proxy for biological traits in medicine perpetuates discrimination and dehumanizes people and justifies systemic racism in healthcare, especially with things such as racialized science, in which people attempted to explain differences within the race and perpetuate harmful myths, such as things like Black women don't feel like pain in like the same capacity as other people, which has real harms in the terms of like how and whether people, specifically Black women, are believed within like the medical system, whether like their pain is taken seriously, and it has huge ramifications for the life outcomes and life expectancy for Black people. And the impact of this is structural, as Black people in medical research who are marked as disposable are exploited and their health and rights ignored by the system, and it ultimately leaves them vulnerable to higher levels of death as a result. Next is the second advantage, which is the vaccination advantage. In like short, the vaccination advantage is essentially just going to say that, especially due to the legacies of medical racism, especially within America, there's a high level of distrust when it comes to medical opinions and the medical system as a whole, which then means that things such as vaccinations are inherently distrusted by people due to that lineage of exploitation which existed, which means that more and more like diseases and which need vaccinations may not exactly like reach the level of herd immunity which is needed in order to prevent them from spreading, which is bad for public health as a whole. So the first card in this advantage, the Funk 2022 card, states that Black Americans have a high mistrust in medical research due to past abuses. Again, with the recurring examples of like the Tuskegee study and like Henrietta Lacks cells providing the context for that. And that the legacy of these wrongs does influence vaccine hesitancy and general distrust in medical practices among Black communities, and that it is important to acknowledge and compensate for those past abuses to rebuild trust and improve health outcomes, especially when it comes to vaccine acceptance. The Route 2016 card states that traditionally informed consent fails to fully protect research subjects and leaves them unaware of the scope of research and the potential harms that may come from that research, and that advocating for property rights such as like the plan would allow for individuals to have control over how their bodies are used, their genetic materials are used, and to ensure that they are able to share in the profits from their actual biological contributions. The Jaffa 2010 card states that the plan is key to restore public trust, that any alternative is morally wrong, especially because prioritizing research over the rights and dignities of the tissue donors, ends up risking exploiting human bodies and people for profit, and it undermines individual protections and it violates ethical standards. And public participation in medical research requires trust, which means that there will be a loss of research that is valuable if individuals feel like their contributions are undervalued and that they cannot trust the ongoing medical system with their bodies, with their genetic material, with their biological material. And that would lead to resistance and potential legal challenges if it is found that without their knowledge, their genetic or biological material is being used for studies or for treatment without their prior consent, which will then end up backlogging those studies. And Allen et al. 2022 states that medical mistrust lowers vaccination rates, and that people who distrust the medical system are less likely to get vaccinated, which each point increase in mistrust being linked with a decreasing likelihood of vaccination by 16%, and that the mistrust of government, vaccines, and pharmaceutical companies have been a significant reason for vaccine hesitancy in the US, especially during the pandemic. And despite the urgency of COVID, mistrust in medical institutions caused many individuals to delay or refuse vaccination. And the last card in a vaccination advantage states in Yan et al. 2020 that achieving herd immunity through high vaccination rates reduces the transmission of diseases and protects vulnerable populations. And a perfect case study for this are flu vaccinations, as that alone prevents tens of thousands of deaths annually, specifically about 60,000 deaths. And increased vaccination rates help prevent overwhelming healthcare systems, especially in cases during the pandemic, for COVID, and then also when it comes to seasonal flu.